Hi, thank you so much for having us here today. My name is Josh Simmons. I'm a short stack web developer and open source advocate. Currently, I do open source strategy at Salesforce and serve as board director and vice president of the Open Source Initiative, the nonprofit that, if you were at the keynotes, you might have heard, stewards the open source definition and maintains the OSI approved license list.
And my name's Cat Allman. I'm with Google. I'm on the Making and Science team. I'm also a 3-term board member at the USENIX Association, the original Unix operating system user group.
So this is the point in the talk where we just get a little disclaimer out of the way. Neither of us are, what we say here is just speaking for ourselves as individuals.
Yes. If we say something that offends you, please don't blame our companies. Talk to us afterwards.
Yes. So we want to talk to you today about, surprise, open source citizenship. There we go.
Clickety-doo-dah. Yes.
All right.
Okay, depending on who you ask, open source, or rather, free software, started in 1983. Personally, I think it started earlier, but anyway, 1983. At the time, it was a radical idea.
In '98, open source was coined as a way to encourage the adoption of free software by corporate players. And now, free, libre, and open source software, or FLOSS, is everywhere. To say nothing of the way that this approach to intellectual property and collaboration is shaking up other fields. Now, in 2019, FLOSS is an inextricable part of the global infrastructure, and it's massively accelerated developer innovation and developer productivity.
Go for it.
Sure. As we discover the many benefits of embracing FLOSS, we also begin to understand that our compliance efforts are just table stakes. This is when it dawns on us that the health of the projects that we rely on is an existential concern for our businesses. Ditto our relationships with those communities.
Healthy projects offer businesses the opportunity to build on existing open source. Unhealthy projects are a risk to companies as they are to the projects themselves. So it's in everyone's best interest to maintain a healthy ecosystem of sustainable, there's that word again, healthy projects.
Healthy projects offer regular releases, reliable security reporting procedures, and new development from more people than we could ever dream of hiring. So it's in our interest to have healthy projects.
Yes. And unhealthy projects, as I mentioned, if nothing else, the potential for increased security risks with projects with unhealthy internal structures is dangerous to all your businesses.
And all your users.
Yes. So, health is hard to define, though.
Hard to measure, too. Getting a bit easier thanks to projects like the Chaos community. And while much has been made of the struggle for open source contributors and projects to get the financial support that they need, we can't just throw money at the problem. Frankly, money can make things worse sometimes.
But what can make things better?
Thus, open source citizenship. Last fall, we spoke to, last winter in fact, we spoke to leaders at corporate open source programs offices, or OSPOs, leaders of projects and foundations. And so we sort of got a survey of what people are doing presently to engage and support with open source communities, and also what communities are asking for.
So now we get to ask you all. Haha, you didn't know this. You thought you were going to a talk, right? No, you get to talk. Let's start with a show of hands. Who here is representing an open source programs office from a business? Oh.
Excellent.
Okay, so what was that, like 40%?
Yeah, just about.
Okay. Who's here representing a project?
Or a foundation.
Okay, we've got some repeats.
Okay.
And those of you that didn't raise your hand, anybody want to shout out what brings you here?
Informal efforts to build an OSPO. Excellent. This is the right place for you to be. Thank you for being here.
Excellent.
Being a member of an open source community. Perfect. Okay, we've got the right audience for this. This
Cool.
is good.
All right.
So today we're going to talk about what companies are currently doing to support open source projects, what forms of support communities are asking for, those aren't always the same, how we can foster a culture of open source citizenship at our companies, and lastly, how projects can make it easier for us as in like the corporate players, to help them and provide support. All right.
So, starting out, what are companies currently doing to support open source communities?
First and foremost, upstream contributions.
Yes, when your people inside your companies create code based on open source, do you allow them to contribute back?
When you fix a bug, are they upstreaming that patch back to the project? When you create something, a novel feature, are you adding that back to the community? Or are you creating plugins or other novel things that are perhaps not directly related to the project, but go hand in hand with it? Yeah. Are you contributing to the ecosystem?
Libraries, big one there.
Exactly, libraries, plugins, adapters, you name it. Another thing that companies are doing are hiring contributors.
For example, at Google, Junio Humano, who is the maintainer of Git, works for Google full-time maintaining Git. We have a number of other projects, people on the Linux kernel, Jeremy Allison on Samba. It's great when these people who are core to important projects don't have to essentially have a day job, but rather their day job can be that project. Go ahead.
Projects or companies are also being members of foundations, providing support to projects that way. They're sponsoring events or the foundations that are providing support for those projects.
Event sponsorships. We're all here in part because of the largesse of, it's not really largesse, they're getting a lot of marketing money out of it. But anyway, OSCON runs because they have sponsors that provide money.
And that's often true of projects as well. We'll have questions in each section, so or a moment for questions in each section. So if you have a thought, hold on to it.
Examples of programs to get new contributors engaged. Obviously, I work for Google. I'm very excited about Google Summer of Code and Google Code-In for teenagers. There's also Rails Girls Summer of Code, the new season of Docs, also a Google program. X.org has Endless Season of Code. There's actually a bunch of them. The European Space Agency has one too. It's pretty inspiring to see the idea of these financially supported onboarding opportunities spread around the world.
Right, and these programs are ways of getting new people involved with projects and helping particularly students or underrepresented people get familiar with open source, learn sort of on the job, often get paid a stipend at minimum, and be paired with a mentor so that they can navigate the complexity and challenge of joining a new community and becoming a contributor. Companies.
Sharing the experience. Are you all familiar with the To-Do group?
Raise your hand if you do not know what the To-Do group is.
Oh, great.
Excellent. This is also perfect.
Some new information. I'm excited. It's a group, I believe it's under the Linux Foundation umbrella. It's representatives from open source programs offices from a wide variety of companies who come together to share how each of their companies does open source. Rather than having to reinvent the wheel, it gives people the opportunity to share best practices, bounce ideas off of each other, collaborate where it makes sense. It's kind of obvious that in open source, corporations should open source their open source, but it didn't used to happen. Now it does.
So I highly recommend checking out the To-Do group. They have a great Git repository with guides and collections of resources. But beyond the To-Do group, companies are just generally sharing their experiences as they figure out how to do open source. And the more that companies can share that, the easier it is for the companies that come next. Okay, so there's a lot of things. If you want to take photos of slides, this is one of those to do that with.
Yes. We try and mash all this so you don't have to load up your camera with a few big words at a time.
So this is the first time we'll take an opportunity to solicit suggestions from the audience. It'll take about 90 seconds here, so we're on the clock. Is there anything that we've missed that you think companies are doing today to support open source projects and foundations? You can just shout it out.
Providing venues for projects to meet either co-located or on its own.
Providing projects, venues to projects so that they can meet. Absolutely.
You touch on funding, but out on the floor there was a great example where it's like, take a sticker, we'll donate $5 to the org of your choice. I was like, whoa.
So this.
That's very cool. I hadn't seen that.
So as Michael noted, there's an exhibitor here on the floor that is letting people vote to support projects, and that is a wonderful product of Dwayne O'Brien at Indeed, and yeah, definitely like kudos. If you have not swung by the Indeed booth, please go vote, and that will drive more material support to these projects and foundations. Denise.
Under other kinds of support, a fair number of famous projects wouldn't exist without the financial and legal support of brick-and-mortar companies.
Yeah.
We forget sometimes the extent to which that's true.
Absolutely. So companies have also provided not just financial support, but legal support. Suffice it to say, lawyers' time is not cheap. And if a company is relying on a project and they're making a profit based on that, certainly providing that is a very valuable way to give back to the community.
Yeah.
Yeah, the legal support side of it is really big, and that's a lot of like just hand-holding management, especially in smaller companies.
Yeah.
Smaller companies in Australia.
Absolutely.
Just hand-holding that management into not being afraid of what that licensing is.
Let's see.
I saw one last hand that we'll get to.
Signal boosting for marketing.
Oh my gosh, thank you. Signal boosting for marketing. Absolutely. Your company probably has a Twitter handle. Your open source programs office or your engineering org might have a Twitter handle or other like marketing channels. Use those, lend those platforms to the projects that you rely on. That is a great way that companies provide material support.
And this is a great segue to the next section of our presentation, in which we'll be talking about what kinds of support are open source communities asking for. Sounds like we've got legal support, marketing support. What else?
Communities are also asking for contributions beyond what we typically think about. Often in open source, we get a little myopic and we think about code. Increasingly, we're talking about documentation, which is great. That's progress. But we need more. We need design. We need user interface help and user experience. Suffice it to say, I think we can all agree, UI, UX, design, usually not where open source shines. So if you have people on staff who can support that, please direct them to these projects.
Yeah. Shall we? And then there's contributing beyond what you need. There is somewhere between fact and meme lies the place where companies contribute back to open source, but only on exactly what they personally are using, personally in the corporate sense. If your company can be persuaded to do more than the bare minimum or more than only the self-interested stuff, but rather help the project as a whole, that's a huge benefit that projects are asking for.
I think this really is I want to take just a brief moment to note that this is a point that really gets to the heart of what open source citizenship means. And I've had somebody point out earlier today that citizenship maybe is too strict of a word to use because, immigrants, expatriates are also contributing and have ways to contribute. So all of us are here in Portland, and maybe we're not paying sales tax. Thanks, Oregon. But we pay taxes whether or not we're citizens here. We're all contributing, and those taxes go to things that maybe don't directly benefit us, but promote the social good. And so drawing on that, if we can contribute to projects beyond the narrow thing that our company needs, then that will go a long way to creating a culture of stewardship, of engagement, and generosity that will make these projects that much more healthy.
Yeah. We talked about testing and QA, I want to call everybody's attention to one example of this, which is the open source fuzzing project. It's available on GitHub. It's basically exactly what it sounds like. It's a open source fuzzing project for open source projects where you can hopefully identify and have the opportunity to fix security holes if your project feels the need, or maybe even if it doesn't. Please do check it out.
I'll note that the OSS Fuzz is also part of a bug bounty program. So not only can your project receive monetary support for addressing serious bugs in the project, you can also receive monetary support and rewards for integrating fuzzing as a testing method to continually harden your software.
And I should mention, this is a Google project that we did because we think it's important. There.
Couldn't agree
I was
more.
wearing my Google hat just then, in case you couldn't tell.
The next thing that we heard communities asking for in the session that we ran was placement of senior employees as mentors in the community. I find that often for instance, in the outreach programs that we referred to earlier, often the people who are placed as mentors are maybe direct contributors to those projects. They're sort of line engineers or writers who are in the trenches. I think that's great. I think we should also be placing more senior people in the organization, our architects, our people who think about strategy, into the community as mentors, because communities need all types of mentorship from all different skill sets and skill levels.
Fund conference travel. This is something that we get asked for a lot. It's one thing to sponsor a conference, but getting your contributors physically to the conference is actually a completely different bucket. It can be an awkward bucket to fill within corporate accounting structures, but it's an important one, and it's something that communities ask for.
And it's not just travel to conferences. It's travel to sprints that might be at those conferences, to summits where technical decisions might get hashed out or critical bugs might get fixed. So these are really, this is an essential way to provide support for projects to help them move forward in very tangible ways.
Event space. For example, there is a sprint held adjacent to FOSDEM, the big open source conference in Belgium every year, that Google hosts at one of our offices, organized by one of our engineers around a project they work on. We have space, we provide the food because people got to eat, and they code better when they're not hungry or running out for lunch. If you have a spare conference room and you've got engineers that are participating in an open source project, if you can make that conference room or event space available to sprints, summits, et cetera, it's a big help for the community, because event space with decent internet access that doesn't cost an arm and a leg can be astonishingly expensive.
This is priceless.
Yes, and if you don't have event space, maybe you could at least underwrite event space for the projects that you rely on. This is an interesting one.
I'm going to let him do this one.
Yeah, I'm excited about this one. So I don't know about y'all, but when the last several jobs that I've signed on the dotted line for, I gave up a lot of rights to my own intellectual property. The rule is generally like anything that you write while you work for this company, we have like the right of first refusal to say we own that. Sometimes they're a little more reasonable to say, well, as long as you don't use our machinery and you don't do it during work hours, then that's yours. The reality is, those contracts are one of the barriers to allowing companies' employees to be regular contributors to projects. If your staff don't have to worry about who owns the code and what kind of processes they have to jump through to contribute to a project, if you can lower the barriers to contribution, surprise, they'll contribute more. So I want to give a plug here for Software Freedom Conservancy's Not Quite program, sort of idea, dream that they could use more support and help in realizing what they call the Contract Patch Program. Because when we as potential employees, as candidates, get a job offer, that is the moment where we have the single most power at any point in our relationship with that company. Because they have invested so much time in searching for people, they've interviewed numerous candidates, they want this to end. It's been an expensive and time-consuming process. They've given you an offer. This is a great time to negotiate, not just for monetary compensation and what have you, but also for the contract that you sign with the company. Now, not every company has that flexibility, but the more of us who ask for that, know that they're desperately looking for talent, the more that candidates ask companies for these contracts, the more companies will start coming around and invest the resources to make it happen because they need us. Okay, get off the soapbox now.
All right, and looping back to this, abiding by community norms is very important. I'm sure probably most of us in this room have had occasion where a company will say, we're going to sponsor your project, and in return, we want you to do blah. We want you to direct your project in one direction or another. There are projects who are fine with that, and that's, your choice. But basically, I would hope that corporations would be more, take a longer view and have a more open hand when they sponsor projects. But that loops back to abiding by community norms. If you're interested in sponsoring a project which is up for having its development direction dictated by sponsors, then go for it. But if you want to interact with a community that doesn't want to interact with its sponsors that way, I would hope that you would embrace their community norms and work with them anyway. That's my soapbox.
And it goes beyond just influencing technical direction. It also goes to what are the communication methods that project prefers, right? Hop on their IRC or their Git or whatever, or their mailing list, whatever it is they use, meet them on their turf. Also, if there is a license that is commonly used in a given ecosystem or with a given project, my goodness, use the same license when you build things to interact with that project. That's just the humane thing to do.
Encourage universities. It's astonishing to me that still people come out of universities, schools, even coding camps without the basic understanding of open source, be it working with version control systems or the simple ABCs of what a software license means. So anything businesses can do to encourage universities to teach the basics and then recognize the work that students are doing as individuals as being part of their education would be super helpful. In this case, companies are in a position of power to help influence what universities recognize. So we would urge you to seize the power and help students get the credit that they've earned.
I will just note a key word here. If you're ever in a position to drive this kind of change, a key word might be the curricular practical training letter. That is a basic form letter. You can find examples online. You can give that to a student to detail the contributions or the commitment they've made to a project over time. And that is the kind of thing that universities' admissions offices or whatever the relevant office is, will use to say, yes, we've got the third-party recognition that this student has done something worthy of university credit.
And if you're in university and you're not trying for that, you might as well give it a shot, because university credits are really expensive, at least in the United States. So you might as well see if you can get credit for the work you're doing anyway and save yourself the cost of the credits in a classroom.
Absolutely. Okay.
This is when we have the black slide, that's our opportunity to take a breath.
Yeah.
Everybody take a breath.
Okay. Another list slide for you.
Yes. And another opportunity for you guys to tell us what we're missing. Those community members, what didn't we include? Are there things that your community would like that we didn't mention here? Denise?
A lot continuing to advocate for them not doing that is really important, and it's important for the really big companies to be the ones that do that advocating.
Excellent point. If any of you didn't hear that, she makes the point that companies need to advocate to universities to change how they view the intellectual property created by students and be more open-handed, because as she very wisely pointed out, if CERN had taken that kind of grabby approach, Tim Berners-Lee would never have released the World Wide Web, and none of us would be sitting here in this room, or a lot fewer of us anyway.
You've not touched on a really polite way of putting it is professionalism, because when you have corporations and the community collide, you may have very mature behavior at one end and behavior that is examples in code of conduct talks at OSCON at the other end. And are there opportunities and examples of when organizations, businesses, companies, where everyone seems to get along really well, have coached communities on some of those more chemically driven aspects of participation?
Well, in my former role of sponsoring projects and events for Google, I have had occasion to let organizations know why we would not be sponsoring based on past behavior. And it's not my favorite part of what I used to do, but I would like to think that it did result in a more welcoming community on the part of that event or organization. Can you tell how hard I'm trying to be diplomatic here?
I would tag on that and say, if you could help a community or a community event hire a consultant to work with them on code of conduct, rather than be like, I'm going to tell you how to do it. Like, I'm going to help you. We'll pay for a consultant to come in and help you.
Oh, that's a new one. Thank you.
The suggestion there is that perhaps you don't necessarily need to have that conversation, be a coach yourself, but you can help fund, for instance, a consultant. There are people who specialize in these things. You should pay them. They do a great job, and they'll make a big difference in your project, in your community. You can help fund that for the project as a way of empowering them to be more professional or more welcoming or just not a toxic space.
Research papers. So one thing that I did when I did my research was I went up to my university administration and said to them, I'm going to be putting this under a copyleft license. And there's quite a few of us that have done that, and it's a hard discussion to have.
Yeah.
And I think certain universities, obviously the bigger ones, might be a little bit more precious about their IP,
Yeah.
as Denise has said. But I think having that discussion and being the first person, I know I was the first person at my university to do that can set an example, so other people have then taken their research and put that under copyleft.
The suggestion here is to work with universities, not just as Denise said, to make sure that the work that they're doing is open licensed and not proprietary, but not just the work product, but also the research paper, Amy points out, should be able to be open licensed as well. And I'm certainly a fan of like open access and open, it's another topic, it's another thing that I think both of us get really passionate about.
But is a bad thing.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
This one might be maybe a little controversial, but data. I know there's a lot around data, and data's kind of the new gold or oil rush. So companies being more open with sharing if they have vast amounts of data to do large modeling or things that might be hard for startups or communities to acquire.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the suggestion there was data, and I think that harks back to, for some folks who were in the keynotes this morning, one of the keynotes was open data, open papers, something like that, and it was effectively about sharing not just here's an open access paper, but here's the data to go with it. Here's the data that we use to train these models. I think there's been a lot said recently about the climate impact of training, using machine learning and training models. So the more that companies, for instance, can, if they've got a model that's well trained, and they can share that without, privacy concerns, then that's something that they can do to make things much easier for communities to put machine learning to good use.
Yeah.
Okay.
Jen?
I don't know if
one of the things that I think would be rad, again, not sure if it's feasible, but providing perhaps like micro funds to folks that contribute significantly and do very good work on open source projects would help alleviate that stress.
Ah, thank you. That's a very good suggestion. And at this point, I have to mention another Google program called the Open Source Peer Bonus, where we ask Googlers to nominate individuals outside of the company for a peer bonus for their work on open source. It's not a living wage, it's more like a nice thank you, but we do try and do that, and I personally hope that we'll be expanding the program. I'm looking at the woman that runs it, who's sitting here in the front row. But thank you for the suggestion.
And building on that, and the point was ultimately that employers are often looking at someone's, say, their commit history or something. They're looking at treating GitHub as part of the resume, which, yeah, sure, that may be a useful tool, but the reality is that many people don't have the privilege of working for free. And so not only are there things like the peer bonus program, which can provide like small bits of financial support sort of after the fact, this brings up something we brought up earlier in terms of what companies are doing to support open source projects, the outreach programs. So you take I'm going to use Outreachy as the example here. Outreachy, which is another project of the Software Freedom Conservancy, it connects underrepresented people, whether they're students or junior, early career people, wherever they are in their life, underrepresented people, connects them with mentors, as well as a project that they can work on for a period of time, and a stipend, which allows them to sort of treat that like an internship. It's like a job replacement, and so that's a way to get paid, get mentorship, which comes with connections, and then also be able to do work in the open so that when, for better or worse, a hiring manager looks at you and says, well, show me the proof.
Show me the code.
You can do that because you've been paid to do some open source work. So there are some outreach programs that do that. Rails Girls Summer of Code was one of the other ones we mentioned. They're taking a year off right now because it's grown so much, and it's grown so much beyond Rails and Ruby that they're looking to retool it. But I really encourage people to look at those programs. Again, I think the three headline ones would be Outreachy, Google Summer of Code, and Rails Girls Summer of Code. There are others as well, but those are the three that you really must remember.
So in our remaining 6 minutes, we have more slides. Surprise. I think we should motor along here.
Yes, so we may move a little more rapidly through these. So, how do we make our companies better open source citizens? I know a good number of you raised your hands and you're looking for how to do this. This could be the subject of a whole series of talks, but we only have a few minutes. So, first, enumerate and value your dependencies. Do you even know what projects your company relies on? Do the people who make the budgetary decisions know what companies you rely on? Do you know how much money you're making from those projects, or how much you're running those projects? Like how much compute time are you dedicating to them? There are various ways of valuing the projects that you rely on. But the first step is just enumerating them. Make a list. Make it clear how existentially dependent your business is on open source. And then it gets a little bit easier to say, sponsor open source projects.
Or have your employees actually work on those projects during work hours.
Exactly.
Okay. Incentivize contributions. People shouldn't have to sneak around after work to contribute to open source. Ideally, your company would, be it in an organized 20% time or just more informally, recognize, encourage, and then value through your performance review process people's contributions to open source times.
And raise internal awareness. So you've enumerated your dependencies, and you found ways to have managers incentivize and reward open source contributions. Do people know that they can do that? Do they know that they're going to get rewarded for it? This requires internal outreach on a pretty consistent basis with all your new hires and all your existing staff to let them know that they can do this, and they should.
And then train your people. It would be great if we all exited the womb knowing everything we could ever possibly need to know, but it doesn't actually work like that. Make training opportunities available to your people, whether it's sending them to conferences like this. Google has a thing where Googlers train other Googlers. There's a big long list of every imaginable kind of skill or practice. And people are given the time to do that during the workday to go and learn these things. It benefits the company, it benefits the individual. Happy employees tend to stick around, and it's a lot cheaper to continue to pay people than it is to find new ones. And their work gets better. So it's a win-win all the way around.
Further, just like many students through university don't get experience working on open source projects, turns out a lot of professional developers or professional contributors haven't done that with open source projects either. So hold a hack day, hold a training session just to walk them through their first contribution. Make it a little bit easier, demystify open source contribution for your people. Okay.
Breathe.
And then hurry along. Now we're going to skip questions here because we only have so much time here, but here's another list slide for your photogramming opportunity.
Okay, cameras down. Onwards.
Okay. How can you help us help you? So say you're involved with a project or a foundation. How can you make it easier for companies to actually provide support for you?
This is one I used to struggle with all the time. Can each of you who's worked on a project give a one-sentence answer to the question, what does your project do? What value does it deliver? I am astonished at the number of people who have never done an elevator pitch for their own project. And when you go online to try and find out what it is, I mean, maybe it's a form of ritual hazing where you actually don't want new contributors or users, which is fine, but I would urge you to have a simple, easily digestible explanation of the value of your project readily available.
Now, I'm watching the clock tick, so we're going to move.
Tick-tock, tick-tock. Clear project governance and licensing. Wearing my sponsor hat, I want to know that your project is not run by 2 or 3 jerks who can't get along with anybody and their project is going to explode within 6 months, making the sponsorship I just gave to it vanish into the ether. And oh, by the way, the licensing is not clear, so we couldn't have added the code base to ours anyway because we'd get sued. So that, in a nutshell, is why you need governance and licensing for your project, if you want sponsorship.
You also need to have a way to receive money that's not writing a check to an individual, because companies aren't going to do that.
Or if they do, that individual might get stuck with an enormous income tax bill that they don't want to pay.
So one solution to this are fiscal sponsors, nonprofit fiscal sponsors, like Software Freedom Conservancy, Apache Software Foundation, Eclipse Foundation, or Software in the Public Interest, Linux Australia, and the Eclipse Foundation actually has a German wing too. So these are fairly global solutions.
Yes.
There are also lightweight solutions.
Go ahead.
Like Open Collective or Community Bridge, which is new and a little untested, so I'm just going to put the name out there. Don't take my word for it.
Yes. And I will just say, for the love of whichever deity you care for, don't automatically create another foundation, please.
It's not the solution. Have a plan for how to use that money.
There's an example right now of a fairly large sponsorship that went to a fairly large project, and they're bogged down in a quagmire of trying to decide what to do with the money now that they have it. As part of governance, it's good for your project to think about long-range planning and what you would do if you were fortunate enough to receive a good sponsorship, so that when that money appears, you are ready to hit the ground running, making progress for your project. Companies, however, on the other hand, companies are slow to pay. It's difficult for them to offer multi-year support, and they want that project stability. A lot of times I've had projects come to me and say, we we want a commitment from you for 3 or 4 or 5 years, year over year. It's very difficult for corporations to do that kind of long-range budgeting, so you need to think about that. And don't wait until the last minute. I've had people ask me for money for a conference, say 2 weeks before the conference. On average now at a big corporation, if you're lucky, it'll take 4 months from getting a yes, we'll give you money, to actually having money show up, if you're lucky. It sometimes takes a lot longer than that. So plan ahead. Ask early, ask often.
And be prepared to onboard new contributors. If a company is here to support you, that's going to often translate into new people coming to your project, whether that's from the company or other people that they're raising awareness, informing about your project. I think a great thing to do is look at the projects that have participated in outreach programs. They have necessarily structured themselves to be welcoming, to have a good onboarding experience, to have a culture of mentorship. So either your project should participate in one of those programs and learn the hard way, or just look at some of those projects you already have and get ready to accept new contributors. Okay. List slide.
List slide. And we are actually out of time, and so as to be respectful to the next people, if people have, respectful to food, we could do that. If you have questions, suggestions, comments, why don't we all meet up in the hallway and we can let them turn the room. But thank you very much for coming. We appreciate your letting us ask you questions, and you're coming and sitting and listening to us. So thank you.
Thank you so much.